In a very short span of time on the same front, several layers of Russian targets began to show weakness at once. One protective layer was pierced. Forward supply lines came under pressure. Infantry trying to hide were still pulled out of cover. Even fire support positions farther behind no longer seemed as safe as they once did. This is no longer just a story about a few targets being destroyed. It looks more like the battlefield is being stripped back layer by layer, where once the first shield begins to weaken, the space behind it also starts to open up. And if Ukraine is truly creating this kind of pressure, then what is under threat will not be just a few pieces of equipment or a handful of isolated positions. What may be under threat is Russia's ability to keep this entire sector stable. So what link was hit first that allowed this whole chain of pressure to begin? Why could a target that was not on the front line, not a tank, and not field artillery, become the opening point for this entire process? And once that protective layer started to weaken, what changed on the battlefield immediately after that? Let's find out with military force. The destruction of a Russian Palantir electronic warfare system on the southern front was important, not only because a valuable asset was lost, but because of what that system represented inside the wider battlefield structure. Palantir was part of the electronic shield that helped Russian forces interfere with signals, complicate enemy drone activity, and support the defensive environment around key military positions. When a system like that is removed, the result is bigger than the loss of one vehicle. It can weaken the invisible layer that helps other assets survive. That is why this strike deserves to be read as the opening move in a larger sequence. Modern war is no longer shaped only by armor, artillery, and troop numbers. It is also shaped by control of the electromagnetic space, where communication, drone guidance, and electronic disruption can decide which side sees first and reacts faster. A system such as Palantir helps protect that space. It reduces pressure on nearby forces and gives commanders more room to manage threats before they reach critical positions. Once that protection is damaged, the battlefield begins to change in quieter but very important ways. The area may look the same on a map, yet the conditions inside it become less stable, less protected, and more vulnerable to further pressure. That matters most in fast-moving drone-led combat conditions. Ukraine's decision to hit this type of target shows a clear understanding of how layered defense works. Instead of focusing only on objects that are easier to film or easier to celebrate, the strike went after a supporting node that helped other Russian systems function with greater confidence. That choice matters. It suggests a method aimed at loosening the structure around a defended zone before pressing harder in the same area. In practical terms, damaging an electronic warfare system can improve the chances for later drone activity, make detection and tracking easier, and reduce the level of uncertainty facing Ukrainian operators. The real significance of the strike, then, lies less in the wreckage of the Palantir itself and more in the gap left behind. A broken electronic shield can create a chain reaction in which protection becomes thinner, reaction time becomes shorter, and later operations become easier to organize. It also forces defenders to operate with less certainty. That does not mean one strike changes the whole front by itself. It means one carefully chosen hit can alter the local balance and prepare the ground for what comes next. That is why this episode should be seen as the start of a deliberate pattern. The Palantir was the visible loss. The more important story was the opening it created for the next wave of pressure. The loss of the Palantir changed the environment for the next stage of the operation. Electronic pressure on Ukrainian unmanned activity became lighter, which meant crews could work with less disruption and better timing. That shift matters because drone warfare depends not only on range and payload, but also on signal stability, target confirmation, and operator confidence. When interference falls even for a limited period, reconnaissance becomes more reliable and strike planning becomes less uncertain. That does not mean the sky suddenly becomes open. It means the first barrier has weakened enough for the next move to become realistic. In this case, the importance of the Palantir strike lay in the space it created. The destruction of one system began to reshape the conditions around many later actions. It also gave Ukrainian operators a brief chance to work with more clarity before Russian forces could adapt and rebuild the disrupted layer. Once that first barrier was reduced, pressure moved toward Russian air defense. This was the next necessary step because no deeper action could develop freely, while missile coverage still threatened the same area. According to the sequence described in the footage, Ukrainian forces used aerial reconnaissance to locate S-300 systems and then brought in bomber drones to attack them. That was not a separate episode. It was the logical continuation of the same plan. A defended zone can absorb pressure for a time, but once both electronic protection and air defense begin to weaken, the balance inside that zone starts to change. Risk does not disappear. It becomes more manageable. And in war, that difference often decides whether a force stays pinned outside an area or starts moving through it. That is what made the hunt for the S-300 systems so important inside the wider sequence. The later appearance of Ukrainian fighter jets gave the whole sequence greater meaning. Aircraft are not sent into a strike zone simply because a target is important. They are sent when earlier steps have lowered the danger enough to justify the mission. That is why the strike on a Russian UAV command post stands out in this chain. A command post is more than a fixed object on the ground. It is a working point where information, coordination, and launch activity can be directed into action. Reaching that type of node suggests that the outer layers around it had already been weakened. The order matters. Electronic warfare came under pressure first. Air defense followed. Only then did a deeper target become exposed to manned aviation. That sequence shows method, not chance. It also suggests a serious level of coordination between reconnaissance, drone operators, and pilots working inside the same operational design. Taken together, these events reveal a clear operational logic. Ukraine was not striking targets in random order. It was removing layers that protected the same space, one after another, until access improved. That kind of approach matters because modern combat often depends on temporary corridors rather than permanent control. If one side can reduce interference, damage air defense, and then hit a command node in quick succession, it gains more than a single success. It gains momentum inside the battle space. That is the deeper meaning of this phase. The Palantir was not the final prize. It was the first opening. The S-300 hunt widened that opening. The strike on the UAV command post proved that the corridor could already support deeper pressure. And once that corridor existed, the next targets were no longer only in the air or in the rear. They were waiting on the ground, where the next phase of the operation was ready to begin. In that sense, this was less a single raid than a carefully arranged effort to make the defended zone easier to enter and harder to hold for Ukraine. The next phase of the operation moved away from protected systems in the rear and toward the moving lifelines that kept the Russian front supplied. This mattered because a line can only hold when food, fuel, ammunition, tools, and construction material continue to arrive on time. Units such as the Signum Battalion and other Ukrainian drone teams used FPV strikes against trucks, supply vehicles, and other targets moving toward the combat zone. These were not random vehicles caught by chance on an empty road. They were part of the daily flow that keeps positions manned, trenches repaired, and fighting power sustained under constant pressure. A truck destroyed before reaching the line is not only a transport loss, it is a disruption inside a larger support chain that depends on timing, repetition, and safe movement across exposed ground. The importance of attacking frontline logistics lies in what happens after the explosion, not only in the blast itself. When one delivery fails, the missing load can affect several needs at once. A vehicle may be carrying timber for field fortifications, fuel for generators and transport, rations for troops, or basic supplies needed to keep a position working through another day of combat. If those items do not arrive, the damage spreads quietly. Some positions become harder to reinforce. Others become harder to repair. Commanders may have to delay plans, ration resources, or expose more vehicles to danger by trying the same run again. In that sense, Ukraine was not simply hunting moving objects. It was attacking the schedule that held the Russian forward zone together. Once that schedule begins to slip, the stability of the line begins to weaken from behind. This is why drone pressure on supply traffic can carry an effect larger than the number of burning vehicles seen in footage. Logistics is the system that turns stored resources into usable combat power at the point of contact. If that system is interrupted close to the front, even strong positions can begin to lose resilience. A unit may still have men in place and weapons in reserve, yet its ability to sustain action becomes less certain. What appears at first as a small strike on one truck can therefore produce wider consequences. Ammunition may arrive later than needed. Fuel may be saved instead of used. Defensive preparation may remain unfinished. These are not dramatic headlines, but they shape how long a force can keep fighting without losing control of its immediate sector. They force Russian units to operate under growing strain before the main pressure even reaches them directly. Another important point is that this kind of pressure works through repetition. It does not need one spectacular strike to change the battlefield. It needs enough successful interruptions to make every movement forward more uncertain and every supply run more dangerous. That repeated risk can force changes in route choice, delivery timing, escort needs, and vehicle spacing. Each adjustment costs time. Each new precaution reflects a battlefield where the rear of the front is no longer working with normal confidence. That is the larger picture behind these UAV attacks on frontline logistics. They were designed to wear down continuity, not simply to create wreckage. And once the flow of supplies begins to break, the troops holding the next layer of the line are left to cope with growing shortages and rising uncertainty. It is at that point that the pressure moves closer to the infantry, where men trying to spread out, hide, and slip through gaps begin to enter another zone of detection and destruction. Russian infantry in this sector did not move forward as one solid assault wave. They broke into smaller groups, slipped through gaps, and used houses, bushes, trenches, and basements as temporary cover. This method reflected a practical battlefield calculation. If a large formation became too visible and too easy to destroy, then scattering men across a wider area seemed to offer a better chance of keeping pressure on Ukrainian positions. Even if many were stopped, a few might still get through and force Ukraine to react. In theory, that approach could still create danger. In practice, it exposed a deeper problem. On a battlefield watched from above almost without pause, dispersal no longer guaranteed survival. It often turned one large target into several smaller ones that could still be found, tracked, and struck in sequence. What looked like flexibility on the ground increasingly became predictability from the air. That is what made this phase of the fighting so revealing. Reconnaissance drones did not need a massed assault column to generate useful targets. They only needed small signs of movement, a pause near a doorway, a figure entering a trench corner, or activity inside a patch of vegetation. Once a group was detected, the process moved quickly. Observation fixed the location. Continued watch confirmed whether the troops were hiding, waiting, or preparing to move again. Then FPV drones or other strike assets could be directed onto that point. In that environment, concealment still had value, but much less than before. A bush could block the view from ground level, yet it could not guarantee safety from a camera overhead. A basement could reduce exposure to fragments, but it could not protect men once entry points and surrounding positions were known. A trench still offered cover from direct fire, but it no longer ensured safety after detection. Every pause increased the chance that a temporary shelter would become a marked target. The deeper lesson is that Russian infantry were not simply being attacked while crossing open ground. They were being found after trying to adapt. Methods that once improved survival now carried new risks under persistent surveillance. The same act of dispersing to avoid one large loss could create a series of smaller, trackable targets. Darkness also offered less protection than before. Night movement could still complicate detection, but it no longer ensured a clean approach when thermal systems and repeated aerial observation covered likely hiding places. That changed the meaning of movement itself. Reaching cover was no longer the end of danger. In many cases, it became the start of a short countdown between detection and strike. This shows that Ukraine was not only trying to stop infantry in the open. It was trying to remove confidence at every stage of the approach, from movement to hiding to the next attempt to move again. And once that pressure could follow infantry even after they disappeared from sight, the same logic of exposure was ready to spread toward the supporting fire systems behind them. That is why this phase mattered beyond the infantry fight itself. Instead of creating confusion for defenders, repeated hiding attempts often created a map of habits, routes, and pauses that made later strikes easier to plan. Russian artillery in the Lyman direction came under pressure in a way that revealed a wider shift on the battlefield. Some of the guns targeted by Ukrainian drones were not deployed in the open. They were hidden inside hangars or placed in positions that appeared protected enough to reduce the risk of detection. That detail matters because artillery remains one of the key tools Russia uses to hold defensive lines, disrupt Ukrainian movement, and support infantry closer to the front. When those guns are found and destroyed, the result is larger than the loss of a single weapon. It reduces the amount of indirect fire available in that sector and weakens one of the main systems that help stabilize the line under pressure. That is why Ukrainian UAV units keep hunting artillery so persistently. A gun that survives can shape a local battle for hours. A gun that is silenced can quickly change the balance in the same area. The footage from Lyman also shows how sharply the distance between detection and destruction has narrowed. In one case, an FPV drone was able to fly into a hangar and strike the artillery piece inside. That matters because it shows that fixed shelter no longer guarantees meaningful protection once a position has been identified. Walls, roofing, and camouflage can still delay an attack. They cannot stop it when the attacker has repeated observation, good timing, and the ability to guide a drone directly onto the target. This is where the weakness of static concealment becomes clear. In an earlier stage of war, a hidden gun inside a structure might have remained useful for much longer. Now that same kind of position can become a trap. The problem is no longer only whether a gun can be hidden. The problem is whether it can still survive after being found. That is a much harder condition to meet. The deeper meaning of these strikes lies in what they show about the growing reach of drone warfare. Infantry in exposed positions are no longer the only forces under constant risk. Artillery placed behind them is being drawn into the same cycle of search, confirmation, and attack. That means the rear of a defended zone is becoming less secure, even without a major breakthrough on the ground. It also forces artillery crews to think beyond range, ammunition, and rate of fire. They now have to think about routine, exposure, and how long one fixed site can remain usable before it turns into a marked target. Once that pressure begins to affect guns behind the line, the battlefield starts to deepen. Logistics, infantry, and artillery no longer sit in clearly separated layers of danger. They are becoming part of one connected zone of vulnerability. Ukraine is expanding its use of longer-range strike drones in a way that is changing the depth of the battlefield. These systems do not only fly farther, they also connect reconnaissance with attack more tightly, allowing one asset to identify a target while another moves in for the final strike with limited pilot input during the last stage. That matters because range alone is not the main story. The bigger change is that pressure can now reach farther behind the line while keeping the attack cycle fast and flexible. A rear area that once felt safer can now come under threat with much less warning. The danger no longer stays close to direct ground contact. It begins to spread outward into spaces that used to sit farther from immediate risk. That shift changes the atmosphere behind Russian positions. It makes support areas, staging zones, and movement routes feel less secure than before. In this sense, the expanding use of longer-range drones is not just a technical improvement. It is a way of changing how distance works in war. At the same time, Russia is also relying on cheap drones such as Molnya, which can fly for dozens of kilometers and carry enough explosive weight to remain dangerous without high cost or complex design. That makes the sky more crowded and harder to manage. The problem is not only destruction, it is saturation. Even when individual drones are limited, they can still create serious pressure through volume, frequency, and unpredictability. That is why Ukraine has had to respond not only with jamming and conventional air defense, but also with interceptor drones designed to stop incoming threats at lower cost. This is where the conflict enters a new phase. Drone warfare is no longer only about finding a truck, a trench, or a gun, and then striking it. It is becoming a contest between layered aerial systems. Reconnaissance drones search. Strike drones attack. Electronic warfare tries to interfere. Interceptor drones try to break the chain before impact. That creates a two-sided technological struggle in which adaptation becomes just as important as firepower. What appears to be one isolated hit may actually belong to a broader network of sensing, targeting, and interception that is growing more organized over time. The result is a battlefield where each strike says less about one target alone and more about a larger combat model that is now becoming easier to recognize. What emerges from this sequence is not a collection of isolated strikes, but a connected method of war. Ukraine did not rely on one dramatic blow to change the situation. It weakened protection, reduced defensive confidence, pressured movement, and then reached deeper into the same battle space. That progression matters because it shows how modern combat is increasingly shaped by linked layers of detection, disruption, and precision attack. The battlefield is no longer divided neatly between frontline danger and rear area safety. Instead, pressure can move from electronic systems to air defense, from supply traffic to infantry, and from hidden guns to the wider drone contest above them. That is the larger significance of this episode. It suggests that success now depends less on holding one position and more on preserving an entire system under stress. Once that system begins to crack, every layer behind it becomes harder to protect. Subscribe to Military Force for clear, fact-based reporting on war, weapons, and global conflict. This channel does not follow war to glorify destruction, but to help viewers understand its real cost and why peace matters. Stay with Military Force because the more clearly conflict is understood, the more seriously peace can be valued.